So as an INFP and an INTJ, I got my PhD in chemical and biomedical engineering, and then I worked in industry for like 20 years and did research and, a lot of theoretical work, a lot of practical work, a lot of product development and patents and things. And then about 10 years ago, my kids were getting older, they were teens, and I was getting tired of doing the rat race thing, and I really wanted to kind of go back to my roots and make a difference in the world. I wanted to do something bigger, like solve unification, because that was my own personal, I knew that you could unify physics. I mean, of course you have to, because it is unified. I mean, the whole universe is unified, and I just wanted to do it to where other people could understand it and I could understand it. So I thought about it for a long time, and I've talked about how I thought about it in my books, okay? So I'm not going to go into the minute details of that, but the approach that I ended up sticking with is that of a chemical engineering viewpoint based on the theories and the thought processes of fluid dynamics. So the Navier-Stokes equations, for example, model fluids flowing in our reality, and there's also in light theory Maxwell's equations and Faraday's work that led to Maxwell's equations, and they matched perfectly, and that models a different fluid. It's actually it's all the same fluid. Okay, we're all the same fluid, but it matches the fluid that forms a light photon. Okay, so Maxwell's equation models a light photon. Now, it doesn't model it in 3D space in any obvious way. It's just that the sine waves, that move at the speed of light, tell you about the light photon. And that wasn't really enough for me, but I knew that there was more going on than just what the equations show. And what I wanted was not equations telling me what the electric and magnetic fields were at any point in time, space-time, but I wanted a way to visualize a flowing fluid that would give rise to those Maxwell's equations. And that's the fundamental truth, and that's what we human beings can then visualize. That's what I wanted to visualize, was a flowing fluid. And I also got inspired by some of the ancient texts that talk about the void and how that occurred before the Big Bang and all that. So I thought that was a good starting point. What is the void? And so I define the void as what everyone else defines it as. It's so full of nothing that there's no word for it, because it's nothingness. And there was a book written called Something from Nothing, or Nothing Can't Exist, or something like that. I'll put a picture of the book here. But anyway, that book, it talked about how nothingness is unstable. And that's actually the same conclusion that I came to, because let's say you have nothingness. As soon as anything happens within that nothingness, like if it could happen, and I guess it did, because here we are. So that's our premise, is that it must have happened because here we are. So that's proof that something must have happened in that nothingness, or else we wouldn't be here to talk about it. So let's just say one little event occurred, whatever the most small event you could possibly have. Well, how can something occur if there's not a place for it to occur in? So that led me to believe that the void is our fluid of the universe that's everywhere and nowhere. It's completely quiescent, not moving, to the point where it's not even there because it's not moving. But as soon as it starts to move, you have to have space for it to move into, and you have to have something to move, and you also have to have an observer to see it move. So as soon as anything happens, you have a lot of things happening. You have something move, and then everything around it has to move in an equal and opposite direction. And then everything around those things has to move in an equal and opposite direction. And so one event causes this cascade of unfathomable numbers of events that happen. And they're sequential because the first little iota of movement or somethingness that happens starts at a point, and that's what actually defines space, is that when that first thing happens, that's the point. You can call it the center of the universe or the beginning space. Anyway, so then that so the way I drew it on 2D paper would be a little event occurs, which then around it radially causes more events to occur, because the nothingness over here that sees something, all of a sudden this becomes the opposite of that. So that is an event. It's now has an identity. And if you could consider, well, it's another way to look at it would be if you have a still lake and you drop a stone in the middle, you see this radiating outward wave that goes outward in 2D on the surface of the lake. Well, in the 3D ether that the very first event occurs in, you see a spread of infinite activity going outward, maybe bigger than the speed of light. The speed of light is just how fast a certain size scale vortex happens to move in the final soup that's formed. So yeah, so we can't say that it moves outward at any speed yet. Let's just leave that. But here's the thing: is when things are formed in the ether, the natural flow pattern of any one movement is a curve. And curve means that it's not going out, it's going back in. That's inward. Outward, linear, curve is inward. And everywhere we see is curvature. Now, yes, when you have an explosion, you do see things go outward like that, linearly. But, that's a line, right? As opposed to a curve. But if you're an entity among a bunch of other entities and you move, well, those other entities are in your way, so you have to curve. So that's just liquid. But that also happens in the 0 point field in empty space. It's not really empty. So this collection of moving somethings is locally inward, but it's expanding outward as the wave affects things around it. Okay, so you have a sphere of quiescence on the outside, and inside the sphere is where all this activity occurs, and it goes outward like a bubble going outward, and that's the expansion of the universe. But that's not what explains dark matter. The thing that explains dark matter is the combination of that front of activity going outward. Okay, number one, the front of activity going outward, and then the local curvy whirls and swirls of the ether that make up the 0 point field turbulence where we exist. That's us. And then our light and mass, as I explain in multiple chapters in my book, have inward flow characteristics. For example, a light wave is a vortex, like a little tornado, that turns out it has to go forward. That's just its most stable form of flow. And it goes at the speed of light. Okay, so that's what we measure. And that is an inward flow because the flow is as the vortex flows through the ether, the outer ether flows into the vortex towards its tip. And I have graphs of 0 point density measurements of that photon to model that photon. And then if that photon hits something again, so like a snake, its inward flow at the tip sees its tail, like if a photon is caused to bend in space-time and it sees its own tail, it'll suck its own tail in and kind of like superimpose itself on itself in a stable form, and it looks like a toroid of inwardly flowing ether, but it's actually a photon superimposed upon itself that takes on a new form. It looks stable to us. It's still just a photon. It's still a photon going in a tight circle because its own flow pattern is keeping its head along its backbone spine. That's the toroid, which is our matter. And then this toroid and other forms of light and other sizes of toroids together to make the building blocks of the universe that we call matter. Now, all this said, my point is that light and matter are inward flowing, meaning that they take the void or the ether and it flows into these. It accelerates into these. Key point is that it accelerates into these. It's not a velocity. You can't measure the velocity of the void. But the acceleration of the void can be measured. This is just what Einstein said. It's no different than what Einstein said and that everyone now agrees with. So I'm not changing anything. This is not my invention. It's just, this is how I interpret what Einstein said that gets you to the unification. And if you don't interpret it this way, maybe you can get to unification another way, but this is how I get to unification, is seeing the void is still fluid, and if it flows, it's moving ether. I call it moving ether, and really it's the void moving. So it's not really the void anymore, is it? But it's something, it's that basic fluid. It's the most fundamental substance. If we agree on calling it ether. Okay. Now, that's how it's defined, as the most fundamental substance. That flows, it's zero viscosity, zero density, but if it flows with infinitely nested curls and whirls, it's kind of like when you multiply infinity by zero, you get a finite number. And if you're a mathematician, you understand this. So from a mathematical sense, it does make sense, even though it's not, maybe not intuitive, but if you think about it long enough, it actually does become intuitive. That this fluid with zero viscosity and zero density, when it flows in enough nested loops, like if you have one tornado, and then within that tornado you have tiny little tornadoes, and within those tornadoes you have tiny little tornadoes and toroids, all of these add up to form levels of inertia. When you have a bicycle wheel spinning, it's hard to turn it from left to right because it has this angular momentum that's stable and it wants to keep going that way. So when you try to turn it, that turning wheel has sort of this moving resistance which doesn't want to let you turn the wheel. So it feels like you can't turn it, It feels like it's alive. Well, the universe is alive because it has this nested gyroscopic nature within the whirls and swirls of the many different size scales of the etheric flow. So this collection of infinitely nested, inward flowing whirls and swirls of the 0 point field gives an overall inward flow of ether wherever there's something, wherever there's us. So I have an inward flow of ether going to me. And when I say inward flow of ether, what I mean is the ether is accelerating through my body into the earth and is holding me onto the earth. And my body itself, which is made of mass, also has a gravitational attraction. If I was out in space, I would attract dust particles to my body because they would see my mass, and my mass would be bigger than theirs, so they would come towards me. If there's another human equal weight as me, we would find each other because our masses are both sucking in ether. Ether's accelerating into both of us, and so we would come together, and that's the gravitational attraction. Okay? Now, turns out though, so this inward flow is dark energy because it's everywhere in space. And the more turbulent the ether is, say between galaxies when a lot of events are happening, in the interstices of the galaxy, there's a lot more going on there, a lot more gravitational interactions, and so you can imagine that the ether is more turbulent there. It's fluid. And so there's more dark energy in the interstices of galaxies. And that's also what we measure. When you go out between galaxies, there's not much going on. There's just, there's distant things going on, but it's very quiescent, and so there's less dark energy between galaxies, and we also find that experimentally. That's the dark energy. Now, what we see as dark energy, which is the inward flow of ether into all the energy entities of the 0 point field and our bodies and our planets and our stars, that inward flow, has to be balanced by an equal and opposite outward flow. And how that happens is that what I call the bubble around our universe, it's not a bubble like what we see in our daily life as a bubble, but it is spherical and it is expanding. And that's from the very beginning of time, that very first event that occurred, that's causing a cascade of reactions, that's expanding outward. That is like creation of the 0 point field, and it's the creation of stuff and existence and beingness, and that is going outward. So you have like quiescence on the outside of the bubble, and then the 0 point field of turbulent activity on the inside of that bubble going outward. And everywhere inside that bubble is inward flowing ether. So if we're here and the edge of the bubble is here, there's a whole lot more 0 point energy out here sucking in ether than there is right here. So this energy of sucking in ether is pulling ether outward. It seems like it's going outward, like if this is a little particle of ether. It's like, should I go this way or should I go that way? Well, when it's really close to us, it might come towards us, but if it's way out here, it'll go outward. So there's this flow outward as the universe expands. There's this flow of inward flowing ether. And when you have flow of inward flowing ether outward, what we see is ether going that way. And we're sucked out that way. But if we're in the middle of the universe, locally, we're sucked onto our planet. But out there, the formation of larger and larger regions of active 0 point energy is so grand, so mammoth, that what it looks like to us is pulling ether outward that matches the inward flow. And it looks like an expanding universe that's drawing the matter out there further out. That's why we see galaxies that are going away from us, because they're flowing towards the ether that pulls them out that way. Okay, I got my idea out. I'm going to have to edit it. I know that it's not a perfect explanation, but this is the start of me trying to explain what I can see clearly in my Myers-Briggs INFP and INTJ mind. I can see it clearly in a visionary way that's truth, but it's not a language. It's a perception of motion of ether on multiple levels. That's how Einstein thought. You see it first, and then you have to figure out how to use the limited language of mathematics that we have to express that. And for one thing, there is no mathematics yet that expresses just the simple notion of the infinitely nested inward flow of the local 0 point field. Okay, so that, I guess you could say that would be my number one contribution to the unification, is to model the 0 point field. You have to do that. Then you model what comes out of the 0 point field, which is light and mass to start with. Okay, so that's my contribution too. That's what I'm doing. And not that other people haven't done the same thing. I just don't know who they are, but this is my own conclusion that I come to by asking the basic questions. What happens if you start with nothing and start to build your universe? So you start to see the 0 point field emerge, right? And then you see a certain bigger vortex that we will label that as a light photon, because that's what we see with our eyes and with our instruments. And so we have to have some kind of a grounded, physical, knock on the surface kind of a thing that's a real thing that we can hang our hat on and say, this, oh yeah, I see this in real life. I see light in real life. So I'm with you. This is starting to make sense. It fits in with my reality, my vision of reality. And then you start to then understand that theoretically, light can also exist in a very much smaller scale that we can't measure, and a very much bigger scale that we can see. Like the whirling swirl of the galaxy is the same phenomenon of curved flow of the ether that pulls the planets along with it that you see in a photon, which happens to be a twisting inwardly flowing vortex of the ether that pulls the 0 point and its internal particles along with it. So some of these particles are short-lived, but they're still there and they're still inward flowing. They still contribute to the dark energy of matter, which is an inward flow, which looks like mass. Because what is mass? It's something that pulls the ether into it. That ether accelerates into mass. And so if you see inwardly accelerating ether, it looks like there's mass there. But what's mass? Well, the thing is, mass in our day-to-day life is the toroids that are formed in the ether that are stable. And that's what forms stuff that lasts longer and that can store information. And that's mass. But there's other forms of inwardly flowing ether that are like temporary mass. There's just like, it goes inward, makes a little vortex and it goes inward, but then it sort of dissipates because it didn't go into the stable configuration. So it sort of just has a short-lived. And so those are like the particles that pop into and out of existence that everybody sees. That's the 0 point field turbulence. And I guess, the physicists say, well, if they have this range of energy values for one entity that comes in and disappears. So physicists, when they see with their machines and they have collisions of subatomic particles, and they see a subatomic particle that has a certain value or range of values of energy, anything within that range, they call it a XYZ particle. And anything with this range of energies, they call it a ABC particle, like a muon or whatever. And then there's smaller and smaller pieces, and they have this puzzle that they've put together of all the subatomic particles and the rules that they follow. This is what they observe. And so all I'm saying is that, I'm not saying that anything out there is wrong. Everything, I'm just trying to say, here's how to explain it in a way that you can visualize it. And it's the flow of ether. And if we don't have a way to visualize everything with a fundamental method, mine being that of flowing fluid, then we'll never be able to imagine a unification. That's my premise. And so that's why I'm saying, okay, so how would I do that? And this is how I would do it. I would take the beginning of time, see what happens to the void. It's already been done. Everybody's already thought of this. The void is unstable, so you're going to have stuff happen. And then I'm saying that what happens is you have an expanding radius, spherical radius of events that keeps going outward. And we're inside, and now let's just look at the 0 point field and all the flow patterns that make up who we are so that we can understand what light and mass are. And then, you can build all these subatomic particles from that, say what happens at smaller scales, and you can then say, well, the same stuff happens at smaller scales. And so there's universes within, and then there's universes out there that are bigger than us. We're part of a bigger universe. And when I was a little girl, I used to think we could be in the handle of a teacup of a bigger universe, and that's actually true because it's infinite both directions, which is kind of nice because that means that there's a lot of potential for life to continue going on, that we don't just die. We're part of a bigger thing. So, but I'm not going to get into the spiritual aspects of it. I'm here. That's all very important, and don't discount it. I certainly think about the spiritual aspects of it, but for now, I'm talking about the practical nature of reality. I'm proposing an approach to maybe people that are smarter than me or that are younger, that have a whole lifetime ahead of them to develop the mathematics of this. I'm proposing the mathematics, the starting points, but I'm sure like people take Einstein's work and they've expanded upon that. I'm like a Faraday, I can see what's happening, and I'm sort of like the beginning of Maxwell, but I'm not sure that I'll be able to achieve what Maxwell did in terms of the equations perfectly match light. What I can do, though, is say, if you take my interpretation, it matches all the data already. And if you continue to think about it as flowing fluid, I assert that we will go a lot farther towards unification. And in fact, in my perception, this one data point, this one person, that unification is I've already discovered unification for myself, which lies herein. It's that we're moving fluid. Okay, dark energy is explained, of inwardly flowing ether. Hello, Nico. Hello, Nico. He's a good boy. Yes, he is. And then the expanding universe is explained because it's the equal and opposite flow. If you have inward flow, you have to have outward flow to match it. And I haven't ever heard anyone talk about inward flow. A lot of people talk about multiple dimensions. I feel like that's very unnecessary. Let's just say it like it is. We don't have to say it's another dimension. Yes, if you're doing the mathematics, it's another dimension on paper. But what is it in reality? What is it? How can it be more visceral? And by that, I will say that the extra dimensions are really fractally nested, curling etheric acceleration patterns flowing inward and outward out there at a bigger scale. Okay, and for example, if you have a flow, okay, let's just do a flow, and it's flowing inward like with a golden spiral pattern, okay, so that on all size scales it's the same, okay. So everywhere there's a flow, like if this little streamline of fluid flows this way, well, watch it in a stream, you can see it. There's going to be other streams that are smaller that are formed because of this perturbation that's formed with this larger flow. You'll have a bunch of smaller flows, and those smaller flows will make smaller flows themselves, all the way down to 0 size scale, and all the way to the infinitely large size scale as well. And so all of this nested flow patterns, you could call them multiple dimensions, but why not just call it what it is? Nested flow patterns. To me, that means more. And on another line, let's just say the most simple example of this. Why call it space-time? Well, you got to call it space-time to solve the mathematics, okay? Because you got to take X, Y, Z in time and put them in an equation. Now you have 4 variables. So what are those 4 variables, you know? The 4 variables are space-time. Okay, so what we've defined a term space-time. But let's just say, what if you, before Einstein ever did his math, in his mind, he thought of 3 dimensions of space and time. Why do we call it time if it's different from spatial dimensions? Because it's different from spatial dimensions. Time is different from the 3 spatial dimensions. If you have like particles in 3 billiard balls, okay, 1, 2, and 3, and they move in time, what it is in reality is 3 billiard balls moving in time. Now, if you want to do an equation, you can say you collect all the data points of this moment in time, this moment in time, this moment in time, and this moment in time, and then you have a matrix of 3D and time that's 4 dimensions. You could say that 4D matrix is space-time. It's just these things and what their history has been over time. But as human beings, we know that we exist at one instant of time at every moment, and the 3D is always simultaneously. We have 3 dimensions at once, but we only have time at one point in time, and we move through time. So whatever, I'm just saying that there is a difference of space, dimensions, and time, because if there wasn't, we wouldn't have a different word for it. So if you can think of space and time and keep it separately, you will be able to better visualize the inwardly flowing ether. It moves inward towards massive objects as a function of time. And in fact, it accelerates inward. And that's really what gravity is. It's the inward flowing ether that drags things along with it because it's accelerating. If it was just flowing at a velocity, even if, of course, you can't measure that, velocity is meaningless, but if it was moving at a velocity, you wouldn't notice anything because it would just be steady state. But because ether has no momentum to pull you through. But if it's accelerating, then it's gravity, because everyone knows that if Ether accelerates through you. It's the same as you accelerating through ether. And both of them give you a force on your body that is a downward force of you standing on the earth. Ether's flowing through you into the earth because the earth is massive. So I'm going to end with that and say that my theory of unification started. Oh, I'm just wanting you to say hello to the friends out there. Yes. Okay? Will you say hello? Come here. He's a good boy. Yes, he is. Yes, he's a good boy. Okay, go play. He's a kitten. Yes, Nico's a kitten. Well, yeah, so I will end along the notes of how I came to develop the etheric theory, where it came from, why it's not really new, it's just a different way of looking at what's already out there, and by separating space from space-time and time from space-time and just saying we have 3 dimensions of space and time, we can express it in a more visceral, understandable way and look at what gravity is in a more visceral, understandable way. And using the concepts of etheric acceleration, accelerating in time, going faster and faster in time, gives us a better view of what gravity is than trying to make sense of the equations of space-time. Not that they're wrong, they're all right, you know, because they predict everything perfectly. But if you want to understand it, keep time separate, and instead of trying to look at the 2D plots expressing 4D, that's very deceptive. What we need to do is just imagine dust in the ether, to label the ether flowing inward faster and faster and faster. That's gravity. Ether is accelerating in, and also out there it's accelerating outward because of the expanding 0-point field bubble. I mean, not going to call it a bubble, it's a sphere. Well, thank you very much, and I need to delete parts of this. I agree. This is this is a journal. I'm recording my thoughts for future use, sharing them with you if you want, because you'll be able to see how my thoughts progressed and how even someone that's not very well spoken and eloquent can still have valuable ideas. And thank you for being with me on this journey we call life. Peace, everybody. Take care.